Chapter 4. The Problem of Free Will. Learning Objectives. 4.1 Explain the relationship between determinism and free will. 4.2 Analyze arguments in defense of and against hard determinism. 4.3 Explain the relationship between indeterminism and free will. 4.4 Differentiate between traditional and deep self-compatibilism. 4.5 Explain the role agent causation plays in libertarianism. 4.6 Identify the conceptions of freedom contained in the various theories of free will. Why is there a problem with free will? 4.1 Explain the relationship between determinism and free will. It is natural to believe that our will is free. As we go through our lives, we often deliberate about what we are going to do in the future. Consider the example of John, who just graduated from high school and is trying to decide what to do next in life. He has the chance to go to college and also has an opportunity to work for a year in Palm Beach, Florida, together with his friends. He cannot do both, so John has to make a decision. It seems obvious that the choice he is going to make depends on his will. He seems free either to go to college or to go and work for a year, and if he cannot make up his mind, perhaps he can stay home with his parents for a year and play video games. It is John's decision. In general, we can say that having free will means that we can make choices in our lives and that these choices are up to us. The basic idea behind having free will is illustrated in the adjacent diagram. We all have a strong tendency to believe that we are like John and that we have the ability to make choices and shape our future. Why then do philosophers worry about free will? To understand why some philosophers question whether we actually have free will, let us expand that illustration and consider the past as well as the future. Notice that the past is quite different from the future. John's future seems open. It seems to be up to him to shape his future. The same cannot be said about John's past, which is set in stone. For example, John was born on 17 October 1992. His parents divorced when he was 12, and he drank his first beer on his 15th birthday. All of these events are part of John's past and are not within John's power to change. The question that arises is this: how much power does the past have over the future? If the link between the past and the future is strong, and if there is only one past, then the possibility arises that there is also only one future. The theory that the future is fixed by the past is called determinism. The adjacent illustrations help clarify the basic idea behind this philosophical view. It is important not to misunderstand the effects of determinism. Even if our future is determined by our past, we will not feel compelled to perform particular actions. On the contrary, in a deterministic world, we still make choices, and we still deliberate about what we should do in the future. In such a world, John still contemplates what he should do with his life after high school. He will try to find the option that looks most attractive to him. It's just that John, given his particular past experiences, is determined to make one particular choice, namely to go to college. The other choices are not really open to him. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, 1788 to 1860, illustrated the effects of determinism as follows. Let us imagine a man who, while standing on the street, would say to himself, "It's 6 o'clock in the evening, the working day is over. Now I can go for a walk, or I can go to the club. I can also climb the tower to see the sunset. I can go to the theater. I can visit this friend or that one. Indeed, I can also run out of the gate, into the wide world, and never return. All of this is strictly up to me. In this way, I have complete freedom. But still, I shall do none of these things now, but with just as free a will I shall go home to my wife. What Schopenhauer nicely explains here is that we do not lose our sense of freedom even if our future is already determined. The man who stands in the street and contemplates what to do after work was determined to go home to his wife. He is nevertheless quite happy to think about all the things he might do instead, even though, given his past, he is not going to do any of them. Let us illustrate Schopenhauer's thought with an additional example. Consider the case of Stacy, who is 17 years old and sees the US women's soccer team play on TV for the first time. Stacy is excited by the great play of the US team and decides that she wants to become a member of the US women's soccer team as well. However, Stacy has never played soccer in her life, and given her past inexperience with soccer, it seems impossible for her to become one of the best soccer players in the United States. Thus, her past is limiting what Stacy can achieve on the soccer field, although Stacy is, of course, free to imagine that she will be the best female soccer player in the near future. That is a perfectly fine logical possibility, but, unfortunately for Stacy, it is not a real causal possibility. This brings us back to Schopenhauer's insight. Some of the things that we think we can do in the future might actually be ruled out by events in our past. I might think that I will turn into a bank robber later in life, but this is not a real possibility in light of my past education and character development. Given the many outlandish things we think we might want to do in the future, it is easy to understand why we humans might develop an overblown sense of our own freedom. In reality, however, our past might limit our future options much more than we care to acknowledge. We are now in a much better position to understand why free will leads to serious concerns. The main philosophical problem is to explain how the past is connected with the future and what impact this connection has on our ability to make free choices. If determinism is true, it would be a mistake to think that the future is an open field. Instead, each of us needs to acknowledge that, given our particular past, there is only one future path that is open to us. Should we fear such a conclusion? Can we still be free even if our future is already determined? You will soon discover that different philosophers have reacted in different ways to this question. On the one hand, there is compatibilism, which believes that freedom and determinism can coexist. On the other, there is incompatibilism, which believes that freedom and determinism cannot coexist. In the next section, we will explore various versions of these theories. The following graphic overview should help you to develop an initial grasp of the various positions. Food for thought. In popular culture, one can often hear the following: with God everything is possible, or you want it badly enough and work hard enough, then you can achieve anything. Sentiments like these are often expressed in novels, songs, and movies. However, these unconditional proclamations of radical and unrestricted freedom promote an unrealistic conception of freedom. In fact, we can hope to achieve only what is compatible with our past. Why then do so many artists, novelists, and movie makers propagate the notion that our freedom is unlimited? Food for thought. In order to determine which of these various positions on free will is most compatible with your own thinking, answer the following questions with true or false. We will later see that depending on which philosophical position we adopt, we will answer these questions differently. 1. All events are caused. 2. We are responsible for all our actions. 3. In some situations people perform actions, but they are not responsible for what they do. 4. In each and every situation in my life, I could have acted otherwise than I in fact acted. 5. To be free means that one is able to do what one wants to do. 6. If we were to roll back time to the year 1950, history would unfold in the same way as it actually did, i.e., President Kennedy would be assassinated in 1963 in Dallas, Reagan would be elected president in 1080, etc. 7. God knows what will happen in the future. He knows especially what will happen in my life later on, that is, He knows when I will die and what I will have for dinner tomorrow evening, and so forth. 8. Nobody, not even God, can know what will happen in the future because the future has not yet happened. 9. If I had experienced a different childhood then I would make different decisions right now. 10. Even someone who has had a terrible childhood can pull him or herself together and make free and responsible choices about life. 11. Some features of a person's character are caused by his or her genes. For example, genes might make someone extremely afraid of heights, in which case the person is not responsible for the fear or for the actions that result from it. 12. We sometimes act on desires that are not our own but they implanted in us by advertising or peer pressure. The case for hard determinism. 4. To analyze arguments in defense of and against hard determinism. Hard determinists accept determinism and agree that the future is firmly fixed by the past. They also believe that a fully determined future is incompatible with free will, that is, hard determinists embrace incompatibilism. They argue that true freedom requires control over the future, and since we lack this control, we should accept that we are not free. According to hard determinism, our belief in free will is similar to a belief in the Easter Bunny, a childish illusion. To make this view plausible, we need to understand how past and future are related to each other. How is the past able to exercise such a powerful influence over the future? Hard determinists respond to this question by pointing to causality. The past causes the future, and this causal link determines what the future looks like. To assess the plausibility of this claim of hard determinists, we need to take a closer look at the idea of causality. What exactly happens when a particular event causes another event? Consider a set of domino pieces lined up in a row. Now consider what will happen if, at time t1, the first domino piece is knocked over. You do not have to be a physicist to predict what will happen. If the first domino falls at a time t1, at some later time tn the last domino will fall as well. The reason for this is obvious. The fall of the first domino causes the second domino to fall, the fall of the second will cause the third to fall, and so on until the last one is knocked over. This is a good example of how causality works. It is a relationship between events. One event, called the cause, triggers a second event, called the effect, which in turn causes a new effect, and so on. It is interesting to notice two things. 1. The cause of an event happens prior to the effect. 2. Once the cause has happened, the effect has to happen as well, i.e., causes are sufficient conditions for bringing about their effects. These two conditions explain how the past can shape the future. If the past contains the causes for a specific event E, then it is causally determined that E has to happen as well. This insight by itself is not yet sufficient to establish determinism. We can admit that some events, example, the falling of the last domino, are bound to happen because they are caused by prior events, the falling of the first domino, without yet losing our sense of freedom. Who is to say that our actions are caused by prior events in the same manner as the falling of the last domino is caused by prior events? Can we be sure that all events, including our actions, are caused by past events? Unfortunately, there are excellent reasons for thinking that all events, including our actions, have causes. Consider the following example. suppose you are sleeping for the first time at your friend's house. Late at night, you hear a strange noise. It sounds as if someone is scratching with fingernails at the door of your room. You are so frightened that you pull the blanket over your head and pray that you survive the night. In the morning you describe your experience to your friend, who answers, "Oh, this is a very old house. It is full of strange noises." But do not worry, nothing causes these noises. The noises simply happen. You would certainly not accept that as an answer. If there are noises, there must be a cause for the noises. Noises do not just happen out of the blue. But what is true for noises seems true for all other events as well. Consider an airplane crash. We might not know exactly why an aeroplane has crashed, but we do seem to know that something must have caused the crash. The basic philosophical principle at work here is the principle of sufficient reason, which claims that anything that happens does so for a definite reason. We seem to follow this principle in all aspects of life. Think about rainstorms, earthquakes, anger tantrums, or asthma attacks. Wherever and whenever anything happens, it is caused by something. But if we accept the principle of sufficient reason, free will could be in trouble. For now, we are in a position to advance the following argument in defense of hard determinism. 1. All events have causes. 2. All our actions are events. 3. All caused events are determined by the past. Therefore, 4. All our actions are determined by the past. 5. If all our actions are determined by the past, then we have no power to act other than we do indeed act. 6. If we have no power to act other than we in fact do act, then we have no free will. Therefore, 7. We have no free will. This argument for hard determinism has some force. The first part of the argument, premises 1, 2, and 3, is very plausible and is supported by the principle of sufficient reason, as well as by our analysis of causality. The first 3 premises together logically entail premise 4. Premises 5 and 6 are more problematic and can, as we will see later on, be challenged. However, most people who hear this argument for the first time do not object to any of the premises, they simply reject the conclusion. The reason can be seen in our day-to-day lives. We hold each other responsible for our actions. Suppose that I have promised to pick you up from the airport late at night. But I fail to show up, and you have to take a $60 cab ride. You are mad at me, and the next day when I call, you end our relationship. It is clear that you think I could have acted otherwise. However, if hard determinism is true and if I have no free will, then I was determined by my past to miss our appointment at the airport. In other words, there is nothing I could have done differently, so I deserve neither praise nor blame for my failure to be at the airport. But we do blame each other and find fault with our actions, and we also praise each other if we do something well or cease to engage in destructive habits like smoking or drinking. Given that we do hold each other responsible for our actions, we are in a position to advance a powerful argument against hard determinism. 1. If hard determinism is true, then we have no free will. 2. If we have no free will, then we are not responsible for our actions. 3. We are responsible for our actions. Therefore, hard determinism is false. This argument, too, is very persuasive. The logical structure of the argument is a combination of the argument form, hypothetical syllogism, and modus tollens, and is therefore valid. Premise 1 follows directly from the definition of hard determinism, and premises 2 and 3 are, as we have seen, intuitively plausible. We are now in a difficult situation. We have found 2 plausible arguments, one for hard determinism and one against it. A majority of philosophers are defenders of free will and personal responsibility and are convinced that the argument against hard determinism is basically correct. However, if we want to follow their lead, we need to identify the reason that the initial argument in defense of hard determinism is mistaken. We cannot reject the argument simply because we do not like the conclusion. As we will see, various alternative theories of free will emerge as a result of denying one or more of the premises of the argument for hard determinism. Food for thought. It is crucial not to confuse determinist, hard determinism, and fatalism. A determinist holds that the future is fixed by the past. Determinism by itself does not say anything about free will. There are many who believe, for example, that we can be free even if the future is fixed by the past. A hard determinist, on the other hand, holds that we have no free will because determinism is true. Finally, a fatalist holds that some events in the future cannot be avoided no matter what we do. For instance, if you are a fatalist and you go to a fortune teller who predicts that you will become the emperor of China in the year 2050, then if you believe that the fortune teller speaks the truth, you will also believe that it is your fate to be the emperor of China. If this is your fate, then it does not matter what you do. You cannot avoid it. You might decide to leave China and start living in the United States, but eventually, fate will catch up with you and you will become emperor. Most fatalists are not determinists, but it is possible to combine fatalism and determinism. Food for thought. The argument in defense of free will is based on the claim that we are responsible for our actions. Are we, however, always responsible for what we do? Take a look at the following situations and decide whether the people in these situations are responsible for what they do. 1. A very drunk person decides that he can still drive his car home. 2. An illiterate person signs a loan with a 300% interest rate. 3. A 10-year-old child whose parents are professional thieves takes $5 from her parents without permission. 4. A student who has been told by everybody that he is bad at math fails another math exam. 5. A person who had a very serious and painful back injury is told to take strong pain medication. She takes the medication and becomes addicted to painkillers. 6. A 15-year-old girl who has been told at her life by her family that she is too far become anorexic. 7. A 15-year-old boy who grew up in rural South Carolina ends up speaking with a very strong Southern accent that makes it hard for Northerners to understand him. 8. A person who is chronically depressed and who has no health insurance to cover medical treatments commits suicide. 9. A 40-year-old man takes his first VR pill, which has a very strong effect. He subsequently decides to spend $1,000 on sex hotline. 10. A 9-year-old girl kills an 11-year-old girl with a steak knife because the 11-year-old had taken a ball away from the 9-year-old. Food for thought. Most people reject hard determinism because they believe that we humans are morally responsible for what we do. The British philosopher Galen Strawson has challenged the idea that we have full responsibility for what we do. Strawson presents the so-called basic argument: 1. We do what we do because of our character, and 2. We are not truly responsible for developing our character. Therefore, we are not fully responsible for what we do. Strawson points out that our character is formed by factors like education, parents, genes, and historical events over which we cannot be said to have any control. Do you agree with Strawson that we are not fully responsible for the development of our own character, or do you think that we make ourselves into what we are? Can indeterminism save free will? 4.3 Explain the relationship between indeterminism and free will. Determinism is very attractive as long as we accept the principle of sufficient reason. But do we have to accept this principle? Is it really true that all events are caused? Is it possible that some events simply happen without being caused by the past? If we follow this line of thought, we start to embrace indeterminism, which holds that the future is not fixed by the past. Indeterminists challenge the idea that all events are causally necessitated by events in the past and consider the possibility that the same past can lead to different future states. Indeterminism weakens the link between the past and the future and thereby tries to create space for free will. Indeterminism is supported by recent advances in physics. We know that small particles like neutrinos or quarks behave differently from medium-sized physical objects like chairs and tables. A table, for instance, has at each moment in time a certain set of determinate properties. It either stands in the middle of the room or it does not. It would be silly to think that the table exists into different positions at the same time. But the same is not true for small particles like electrons. Although these small particles obey a fixed set of rules, the world of small particles is not a deterministic world. We cannot say that a small particle is at each given moment in a clearly determinate state. All we can say is that if we measure the particle, there is a certain probability that we will find the particle in a certain position with certain properties. Take the example of an electron in a magnetic field. The electron's spin may be either aligned with the field, which is known as a spin-up state, or opposite to the field, which is known as a spin-down state. Prior to any measurements, the electron is in a so-called superposition, meaning that it is simultaneously in a spin-up and a spin-down position. Electrons and other small particles are therefore not like chairs and tables. They do not possess at each given moment a set of clearly determined properties. Thus, small particles do not live in a fully determined world. We can take this indeterminism and apply it to what happens in our brains when we make a decision. When we deliberate whether to go to a party or not, something like the following might be happening in our brains. Suppose a particular small particle is in a superposition of spin-up and spin-down. As we decide whether to go to the party, we conduct in our brains what amounts to a measurement of the particle. If we find it in a spin-up position, we will go to the party. If we find the particle in a spin-down position, we will stay at home. Whether we will find the particle in one or the other position is not causally determined by prior events. Both outcomes are physically possible and can happen. In this way, indeterminism liberates us from the curse of a decision determined by past events. If our decisions are ultimately dependent on indeterministic physical processes, we do not have to be afraid that our future is fixed and predictable on the basis of our past. Although indeterminism can explain why the past has no power over our decisions, it runs into other serious difficulties. The contemporary philosopher Richard Taylor describes why indeterminism is as hostile to personal responsibility as determinism is. Suppose that my arm is free, according to indeterminism, that is that its motions are uncaused. It moves this way and that from time to time, but nothing causes these motions. Sometimes it moves forth vigorously, sometimes up, sometimes down, and sometimes it just drifts vaguely, these motions all being wholly free and uncaused. Manifestly, I have nothing to do with them at all, they just happen, and neither I nor anyone can ever tell what this arm will be doing next. It might seize a club and lay it on the head of the nearest bystander, no less to my astonishment than his. There will never be any point in asking why these motions occur, or in seeking any explanation of them, for under the conditions assumed there is no explanation. They just happen, from no causes at all. What Taylor shows nicely is that according to indeterminism, my actions become random events, and nobody should be held responsible for something that happens randomly. In order to illustrate this further, consider the following example. Suppose Beth and John have been dating for several years. Beth is eager to get married, but John is undecided about whether they should tie the knot. In order to pacify Beth, John comes up with this idea. Each morning he will throw a coin 20 times, and if the coin comes up heads 20 times in a row, he'll marry Beth. Years go by and every morning John throws the coin, but heads never come up every time. Then one day, after 6 years, the unlikely event finally happens. John throws heads 20 times in a row, and he marries Beth. Was John's decision to get married a genuinely free and responsible choice? It seems not. John did not have any control over when or whether he would marry Beth. It seems as if the decision wasn't his decision at all. In order to be genuinely free, we must have control over our actions. The only way we can perform responsible actions is by acting on good reasons. Indeterminism cannot explain how our actions and decisions can ever be under our control because it turns them into unpredictable and uncontrollable events. Food for thought. Some people try to act randomly. Take the example of Claude, who is well known for his erratic behavior. One day you see Claude at a party, where he is drinking heavily. You ask him why he drinks the 10th shot in a row, and he responds, "I have no idea, man. I simply do things. I never ask why." Everybody around Claude laughs at this answer. They say, "That is a typical Claude answer. He does crazy stuff for no reason at all." Do you think that Claude has genuine free will? Compatibilism. 4.4 Differentiate between traditional and deep self-compatibilism. Our discussion so far seems to lead to an intellectual dilemma. No matter whether we think that the future is fixed by the past, as in determinism, or whether we think that the future is not fixed by the past, as in indeterminism, free will seems to be in trouble. Determinism seems to lead to hard determinism, but indeterminism makes it impossible to explain how we can perform free and responsible actions. In order to escape from this dilemma, we need to rethink our preliminary discussions. Perhaps the hard determinists were too quick to conclude that determinism undermines free will. Let us rethink the relationship between determinism and free will and explore whether a future that is fixed by the past can make room for free will. The philosophical position that claims that a determined future is compatible with free will is called compatibilism. The philosophers Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, John Locke, 1632 to 1704, and David Hume, 1711 to 1776, defended early versions of compatibilism. Before we get into the details, let's look at two similar situations. First, suppose that you are walking down the street late at night and that a menacing-looking guy comes up to you and yells, "Your money or your life." Feeling intimidated and scared, you decide to hand over your money. The second situation is different. You are again walking down the same street late at night, but this time a skinny, forlorn-looking teenager asks you whether you can help him to stay alive. Overcome by pity, you give the teenager all the money you have. In both situations, your decision to hand over your money was caused. In the first case, it was caused by the threat of the menacing-looking guy. In the second case, it was caused by your feeling of empathy for the teenager. A compatibilist maintains that our freedom and responsibility are not threatened by the fact that our actions are causally determined to take place. Our actions can still be free as long as they are causally determined in the right way. What's important for compatibilists is that there are no constraints that prevent people from doing what they want to do. In the first situation, you wanted to keep your money, but you weren't able to. Instead, you were forced to perform an action you had no desire to do. This is not a free choice. On the other hand, you freely gave away your money in the second situation, based on your own free will. The basic tenet of compatibilism is that we are free as long as we do not encounter forces that prevent us from doing what we want to do. It doesn't matter that our actions are determined by the past. An intuitive way to explain this feature of compatibilism is to imagine that God exists and that God knows your future. God, for example, knows that you will eat fried chicken tonight. So, when dinner time comes along and you think about your dinner options, could your decision to eat fried chicken be free? A compatibilist would say yes. If you want to eat fried chicken and if you are not forced to eat it, your decision to eat fried chicken is free. It doesn't matter whether God knows about this beforehand. What matters is that you were able to act on your desires and that no constraints prevented you from doing so. At this point, you might be tempted to raise an objection. How can my decision to eat fried chicken be free if I could not have eaten sushi instead? The compatibilist response that could have done otherwise should be understood hypothetically. To say that I could have eaten sushi simply means that if I had had the desire to eat sushi, I could have acted on that desire. As a matter of fact, I did not have a desire to eat sushi, but hypothetically I could have acted on that desire if it had been present. The compatibilist claims that this ability to act on different hypothetically possible desires is all that is required for freedom. It is important to realize that compatibilism introduces a new way of understanding freedom, which does not require that the future is open. All that is required for freedom is that we find no constraints on doing what we want to do. To help clarify this idea, we are going to take a look at two versions of compatibilism: traditional compatibilism and deep self-compatibilism. Traditional compatibilism. Traditional compatibilists suggest two conditions for freedom. An action is free if 1. The action is caused by the will of the agent. 2. The action is performed without constraints. Both conditions are intuitively plausible. Let's consider them in turn. Only an action caused by the will of the agent is a candidate for being a free action. In other words, an action can be free only if an agent's internal feelings, desires, hopes, beliefs, or wishes led him or her to take the action. Consider the case of a man who shot his neighbor by accident while cleaning his gun. In this case, we do not consider the shooting to be an action the man freely performed, and we therefore do not hold the man fully responsible either. On the other hand, if I shoot somebody out of jealousy, or if I hug somebody because I love the person, these actions are truly my actions, and I am responsible for them. In real life, it is rare that we perform actions that are not caused by our desires and wishes. However, it does happen that we are sometimes constrained in doing what we want to do. In such situations, traditional compatibilism is the second condition for freedom that comes into play. My actions are free only if they are performed without constraints, which can come in a variety of forms. I might be threatened at gunpoint, as in our earlier example. In this case, the constraint comes from the outside. In other cases, I might be constrained by a lack of resources. I may want to accept the invitation to attend Harvard only to find out that I can't afford to go there. Similarly, I might want to play Beethoven but realize that my lack of musical ability prevents that desire from being fulfilled. In order to determine clearly whether we are constrained in a given situation, the traditional compatibilist applies the following criterion: an agent is free, not constrained, if the agent would have been able to act on a different set of desires. Consider the case of Bernice, who is afraid of spiders. Whenever she encounters a spider, she runs away. Is Bernice's decision to run from spiders a free action? A traditional compatibilist would say that she is free. She is acting on her desire to run away from spiders and would be able to act differently if she had no fear of the hairy creatures. Nobody is holding a gun to her head and forcing Bernice to run away. Overall, traditional compatibilism leaves us with an attractive and plausible theory of freedom. We are free provided that we are acting on our will and are not constrained. The most attractive feature of this theory of free will is that it is fully compatible with the idea that our desires are determined by the past. Deep self-compatibilism. Although traditional compatibilism offers a commonsensical theory of freedom, it also leads to a number of philosophical difficulties. A traditional compatibilist holds that we act with free will whenever an action is caused by our desires and we were not constrained or forced to perform it. The possibility arises, however, that some of our desires, although they prompt us to act, are not identical with our will. The following example should help to illustrate the issue. Suppose that Henry, a 22-year-old college sophomore, has not yet declared his major, despite the urgings of his advisor and his parents. Henry is torn between majoring in biology and computer science. After careful reflection, he realizes that he desires to study computer science only because his father thinks that it is a good degree with a bright future. Henry comes to realize that if he had no family, he would definitely study biology. Deep down, he has little interest in computers and dislikes writing computer programs. However, suppose that Henry's father is the most important person in Henry's life. Henry wants to please his father and is terribly afraid of letting him down. Eventually, Henry gives in and decides to major in computer science. Was Henry's decision a free decision? A traditional compatibilist has to answer this question affirmatively. Henry had a desire to please his dad, he acted on this desire, and he was not forced to choose computer science. Neither his dad nor anybody else forced him to make this decision. The traditional compatibilist concludes, therefore, that Henry's decision was free. But did Henry really act on his own will? Would it not make more sense to say that Henry acted on the will of his father? If you share this reaction, you might find deep self-compatibilism an attractive theory of free will. It is a refined version of compatibilism that was first articulated by the contemporary philosopher Harry G. Frankfurt. Deep self-compatibilism is, as the name suggests, also a form of compatibilism and thus subscribes to the idea that actions that are determined by the past can be free, but it differs from traditional compatibilism in holding that our will is genuinely free only if we act on desires that we have chosen and that we identify with. These desires are called authentic desires. For a deep self-compatibilist, free will is the ability to act on authentic desires, i.e., desires we truly want to act on. If we act on desires that are imposed upon us by other sources, parents, peer pressure, advertising, we act on inauthentic desires and do not have free will. According to deep self-compatibilism, free will is dependent on what happens deep inside us. Nobody can tell from the outside whether someone is acting on authentic desires. According to deep self-compatibilism, we are full of conflicting desires, all of which urge us to act. However, as long as we are indifferent about which desires prompt us to action, we are not genuinely free. Genuine freedom emerges once we realize that not all of our desires are compatible with the interests of our deeper selves. We therefore must choose which of our desires ought to be the driving force that shapes our actions and lives. Only individuals who have identified their genuine desires and who manage to act on those authentic desires are genuinely free. A good way to illustrate the difference between traditional compatibilism and deep self-compatibilism is to consider the case of animals. Do animals have free will? According to traditional compatibilism, a dog that barks at night performs a free action. The action is caused by its desire to bark, and the dog is not forced to bark. But a deep self-compatibilist would disagree with this analysis. Although the barking is indeed caused by the dog's desire to bark, that desire is not something the dog has actually chosen to have. According to deep self-compatibilism, animals should not be considered to have genuine free will, for they lack the ability to choose and identify with their desires. Human beings, on the other hand, have this capacity. Deep self-compatibilism maintains, therefore, that we act freely only if we act on those desires that we have chosen and with which we identify. A fundamental problem for compatibilism. Although traditional compatibilism and deep self-compatibilism differ in important respects, they share the central assumption that our actions can be free even if they are caused and determined. However, this insistence that determinism and freedom are compatible with each other leads to a central objection. Many philosophers have questioned whether our actions can be free if they are indeed determined by the past. For this reason, William James labeled compatibilism a quagmire of evasion, and Immanuel Kant classified compatibilism as a wretched subterfuge. If we take compatibilism seriously, it seems to follow that we are morally responsible for a future that we cannot change. Is this a realistic idea? Many people think not. In order to understand the objection to compatibilism, it is useful to consider the consequence argument, most recently presented by contemporary philosopher Peter van Inwagen, born 1952. The consequence argument is an argument for incompatibilism that claims that determinism is not compatible with moral responsibility. This is a fairly sophisticated argument, but a basic formulation of it can provide an initial impression. 1. No one has power over the past and the laws of nature. 2. Our future actions are the necessary consequences of the past and the laws of nature. 3. If we have no power over X, then we also have no power over the future necessary consequences of X. Therefore, 4. We have no power over our future actions. 5. In order to be responsible for our future actions, we must have power over our future actions. Therefore, 6. We are not responsible for our future actions. Premises 1 and 2 are very plausible. We have indeed no power to change the past, and as long as we accept determinism, we also have to accept premise 2. Premise 3, which is sometimes called the transfer of powerlessness principle, requires some explanation. Consider the example of Zamila, who was born without arms. It is clear that Zamila had no control over this condition. Moreover, the fact that she never learned how to play the piano is a direct consequence of her disability, given that Zamila had no control over the fact that she was born without arms, and given that her inability to learn piano was a necessary consequence of her having been born without arms. It seems to follow that Zamila also had no control over the fact that she didn't learn how to play the piano. The story about Zamila illustrates why the transfer of powerlessness principle is attractive. If one has no control over a given situation S, and if S necessarily leads to P, then it seems to follow that one also has no power over P. If we accept this principle, then premise 3 of the consequence argument has to be accepted as well, and the argument seems to hold. What the consequence argument shows is that compatibilism seems to lead to a dead end. It might be true that determinism permits us to formulate a theory of free will, but a compatibilist account of free will cannot make room for moral responsibility. This may lead people to ask, "What good is free will if it does not entail moral responsibility?" And this is the main reason that people have rejected a compatibilist conception of freedom. Many philosophers think that it is a necessary condition for freedom and responsibility to have the power to act other than we in fact have acted. This principle is often called the principle of alternative possibilities, PAP. If we agree that PAP is necessary for moral responsibility, then we embrace the philosophical position of incompatibilism, which holds that a world in which the future is fixed by the past is incompatible with freedom. If we accept incompatibilism, we either have to give up on free will, as the hard determinists do, or else we need to explain how an indeterminist world can lead to freedom and responsibility. In our initial discussion of indeterminism, we encountered difficulties in explaining how one could have control over undetermined events. Let us explore whether a more refined discussion of indeterminism can solve this problem. Food for thought. Test your understanding of traditional compatibilism by deciding whether a traditional compatibilist would think that the following are free decisions. Explain your answers. 1. You decide to loan $400 to your roommate after he says, "You are my last hope. If you do not loan me $400, I will have to kill myself." 2. After drinking heavily, you decide to dance naked on the table. 3. After your friend drives you home, you decide to remain in the car with her and listen to her CDs. Afterwards, you found out that she had locked the doors to her car and would not have opened them unless you first listened to all her CDs. 4. After your best friend commits suicide, you decide to make plans to kill yourself as well. 5. After the college you attend raises tuition by 40%, you realize that you cannot afford to pay for it anymore and decide to quit college altogether. 6. You decide to quit your job. As you tell your boss, she tells you, truthfully, that she would have fired you today anyway. 7. While you are sleepwalking, you go to the refrigerator and make yourself a sandwich. Food for thought. Have you ever acted on desires that you did not identify with and that were not truly your own desires? If yes, give a description of some of the situations in which you have acted on inauthentic desires. If not, describe how you can be sure that the desires on which you act are actually your own authentic desires. Food for thought. Decide which of the following listed desires you have. Are these desires that you have freely chosen to have? Indicate which desires are most important to you by ranking the desires you have from most important to least important. 1. I want to have lots of money. 2. I want to find true love and live with one person for the rest of my life. 3. Every other week or so I want to get really high and have a good time. 4. I want to exercise every day. 5. I want to read the most famous books that have been written. 6. I want to have sex with lots of good-looking people. 7. I want to act such that my parents are proud of me. 8. I want to do something in my life that truly matters. 9. I want to help make the United States a more just society. 10. I want to have children. 11. I want to develop my talents. 12. I want to travel to foreign countries and see the world. 13. I want to help people in need. Food for thought. Deep self-compatibilism argues that our will is free if we act on authentic desires, but it is not easy to identify our authentic desires. In the following excerpt from his essay Schopenhauer as Educator, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, describes a methodology that might help us to identify our authentic desires. Read through his suggestions and determine whether you can apply Nietzsche's methodology to your own life. Does this help you to find your authentic desires? When the great thinker despises human beings, he despises their laziness, for it is on account of their laziness that men seem like manufactured goods, unimportant, and unworthy to be associated with or instructed. Human beings who do not want to belong to the masses need only to stop being comfortable and follow their conscience, which cries out, "Be yourself." All that you are now doing, thinking, and desiring is not really yourself. But how can we find ourselves again? How can man know himself? He is a dark and veiled thing, and if the hair has 7 skins, man can shed 70 times 7 and still not be able to say, "This is really you, this is no longer slough." In addition, it is a painful and dangerous mission to tunnel into oneself and make a forced descent into the shaft of one's being by the nearest path. Doing so can easily cause damage that no physician can heal. And besides, what need should there be for it, when given all the evidence of our nature, our friendships and enmities, our glance and the clasp of our heart, our memory and that which we forget, our books and our handwriting? This, however, is the means to plan the most important inquiry. Let the youthful soul look back on life with the question, what have you truly loved up to now? What has elevated your soul? What has mastered it and at the same time delighted it? Place these venerated objects before you in a row, and perhaps they will yield for you, through their nature and their sequence, a law, the fundamental law of your true self. Compare these objects. See how one complements, expands, surpasses, transfigures another, how they form a stepladder upon which you have climbed up to yourself as you are now, for your true nature lies, not hidden deep within you, but immeasurably high above you, or at least above that which you normally take to be yourself. Food for thought. In order to determine whether you find traditional compatibilism more plausible than deep self-compatibilism, it should be helpful to consider the following situations. Determine first whether a traditional compatibilist or a deep self-compatibilist would say that each individual has free will. Decide then whether you agree with one or the other position. 1. Helmut sits in a high-security prison for killing a policeman. Helmut has come to the realization that he is a danger to society and needs to be locked up. He thus decides that he wants to stay in prison and that he would not leave even if the authorities would let him go. Does Helmut have free will? 2. Andrea has a strong desire to undergo plastic surgery. She thinks that her breasts are too small, so she spends her savings on a breast enlargement operation. A year later she breaks up with her boyfriend and she suddenly realizes that her desire to have larger breasts was caused by her boyfriend. She herself prefers to have smaller breasts. Did Andrea have free will when she decided to undergo a breast operation? 3. Nick decides to go to medical school. His father and his grandfather have both been physicians and he is expected to be one as well. However, what he really wants to do is play professional baseball. Does Nick have free will? 4. Rose decides to break up with her boyfriend, Chris. Although Rose herself is very happy with Chris, she can enjoy his company only when the two are alone with each. In the presence of others, Rose feels embarrassed because Chris is greatly overweight. Rose is tired of feeling that embarrassment and decides to end the relationship. Is Rose's decision free? 5. Antonia has a drinking problem. For 2 years he has been trying to stop drinking alcohol but has not been able to do it. Finally, Antonio undergoes hypnosis. The hypnotist tells Antonia that he can implant in him an unconscious response that will make him vomit whenever he smells or drinks alcohol. The hypnosis works, and Antonio quits drinking. Was Antonio's decision to quit a free choice? 6. Nadia has promised her husband, Chad, who hates traveling more than anything else, that she will stay with him forever. After 10 years of marriage, Nadia develops a strong desire to leave Chad and to travel the world. This desire becomes stronger and stronger, but Nadi feels that it would not be proper to act on it. So, she suppresses her desires and remains married to Chad for the rest of her life. Was Nadia's decision free? Food for thought. Daniel Dennett, a staunch defender of a compatibilist account of free will, urges us to consider the case of Martin Luther, the founder of the Reformation. Although it is historically suspect, Luther has been reported as saying at the Diet of Worms in 1521, "Here I stand, I can do no other. God help me, Amen." With these words, Luther rejected the request to recant his theological writings in public. Dennett thinks that the case of Luther provides a good defense of compatibilism if we take Luther's provides a good defense of compatibilism. If we take Luther's words seriously, he seems to have, in this situation, no power to act in any other way than he does act. However, according to Dennett, this does not mean that Luther is not responsible for what he did. The consequence argument is therefore mistaken. Moral responsibility is fully compatible with a future that is not open. What do you think? Is Dennett justified in claiming that the case of Luther supports a compatibilist account of freedom? Libertarianism. 4.5 Explain the role agent causation theory plays in libertarianism. The case for libertarianism. We have seen in our initial discussion of indeterminism that it leads to a fundamental problem. If we think that our actions happen by chance, it seems difficult to explain how we can control them. Here libertarianism comes into play. Libertarianism is a branch of indeterminism that holds the future is open and that we have the power to shape it. If we imagine two agents with the exact same past, libertarians believe that the two agents nevertheless can make different decisions in the present. In addition, libertarians try to avoid the standard problem of indeterminism by developing additional ideas about how we can have control over undetermined actions. Since there are different explanations, there are consequently different versions of libertarianism. We will focus exclusively on an agent causation account of libertarianism since this version is the most accessible. According to libertarianism, there is something special about human beings that makes them different from rocks, trees, or planets. If we translate the libertarian position into religious language, we might say that humans are made to have free will. But what exactly is this extra element that gives humans a status different from that of everything else in the physical universe? The libertarian points to a special form of causal power. In order to understand this more clearly, we need to distinguish between event causation and agent causation. Think back to our discussion of hard determinism and the domino effect. The action of dominoes falling in succession is a classic example of event causation. Event causation is the process of one event causing another. The first falling domino, the first event, causes the second domino to fall, the second event, which causes the third domino to fall, the third event, and so on. What is true for dominoes is also true for other physical events. All physical events are necessitated by other physical events. Physical events are, therefore, determined to take place. However, when it comes to humans, or agents, libertarians see things differently. When an agent acts, the action does not have to be the result of prior events. This means that when you act, there is the possibility that your action is not determined by your past. In fact, agents have the power to cause something without being subject to causal determination. This is known as agent causation. It means that an agent can act without prior events necessitating the agent's action. The agent can act spontaneously to cause something to happen. One way to make agent causation clear is to think about a godlike being prior to the creation of the physical universe. Suppose that this being, let us call it Fred the world maker, decides to create the physical universe. Two things are clear in this situation. First, the creation of the physical universe is caused by Fred's action. Second, Fred's action is not causally determined to take place by prior physical events. There is, after all, no physical universe prior to this action. The deed of Fred the world maker is therefore a self-caused action that originates completely from within Fred. According to libertarianism, all of us are a bit like Fred when it comes to performing actions. Although we are the cause of our actions, we are not causally determined by prior events to perform the action. We therefore have genuine free will. American philosopher Roderick Chisholm, 1916 to 1999, wrote in this context: if we are responsible, and if libertarianism is true, then we have a prerogative which some would attribute only to God. Each of us, when we act, is a prime mover unmoved. In doing what we do, we cause certain events to happen, and nothing, or no one, causes us to cause those events to happen. Problems for libertarianism. If libertarianism is true, we all have the power to act contrary to the influences of our past, our families, and our genetic heritage. What we do is strictly up to us, since we as substances are the causal originators of our actions. The question arises, however, whether this might not lead to a distorted view of moral responsibility. According to libertarianism, insofar as we act as agents, we are as a matter of metaphysical necessity fully responsible for what we do. But this might be difficult to reconcile with how we assign moral responsibility in day-to-day life. In ordinary circumstances, we frequently attribute limited responsibility to agents. Such attribution requires that events play a role in bringing about our actions, and this runs counter to the strict distinction between event and agent causation that is advocated by libertarianism. In order to illustrate this point, let's consider the example of Alexa, who suffers from depression. On many days she lies in bed and finds no energy or motivation to get up. Sometimes she spends the entire day in bed sleeping, much to the chagrin of her mother, who is a staunch libertarian. She firmly believes that Alexa has free will and that no matter how her brain might affect her, she has the power to decide to get up. She likes to say to her, "Come on, Alexa, my free agent, make use of your free will and get yourself out of bed." Doesn't it seem as if Alexa's mother is misunderstanding the position Alexa is in? And isn't it clear that events in Alexa's brain are causing her not to be able to get out of bed? Libertarians are bound to deny this idea. Anything that happens in Alexa's brain is just an event, and according to libertarianism, event causation cannot undermine the freedom to choose. But in this case, as in many others, the libertarian view seems unscientific and dogmatic because medical research suggests that biochemical events in our brains can make it impossible to perform certain acts. In order to respond to this difficulty, the libertarian would need a clear account of how and when events can undermine freedom, but any such AC count might also undermine the necessary clear distinction between event and agent causation. A second group of objections charges libertarianism with introducing too much metaphysical baggage. We have seen that philosophers tend to be careful when it comes to introducing new fundamental entities into our worldview. If it is possible to explain the world without referring to ghosts, vampires, witches, or black magic, the principle of Occam's razor suggests that we should do so. Simplicity is an intellectual virtue. Libertarianism, however, is quite a loaded philosophical theory. It introduces two fundamentally new entities into our understanding of the world: agents and agent causation. The question is whether it might not be better to avoid commitment to these entities. Third, libertarians believe that something very special happens when agents cause actions. Agents can cause actions to take place without there being prior causes that prompt the agents to perform the actions. But if there are no prior causes, how can there be any explanation of why the agents did what they did? The philosopher Harry Frankfurt, for instance, observed that according to a libertarian account of freedom, any free action has the status of a miracle since it interrupts the natural order of causes. But to give free actions that status is basically equivalent to admitting that there are no explanations of how free actions are possible. Miracles are, after all, events that do not fit within our standard explanatory frameworks. Free will turns, therefore, into something mysterious and inexplicable, not a very satisfactory result. Food for thought. In Asian intellectual traditions, the free will debate takes a very different form than people are used to reading about in the Western philosophical tradition. Many strands in Buddhism, for example, reject as naive the idea that human beings have absolute freedom. According to Buddhism, we have to acknowledge that we are creatures with a particular past and with particular needs and desires. These and other factors clearly influence how we act. Many Buddhists also acknowledge that past lives can influence our behavior as well. However, Buddhists do not conclude from this that our lives are predetermined. We have the freedom to develop compassion and to achieve higher forms of being. Buddhism, therefore, cannot be characterized as a form of determinism nor as a form of libertarianism or compatibilism. Buddhism and other strands of Eastern thought go beyond the conceptual framework found in the traditional Western debate. Final remarks on the problem of free will. 4.6 summarize the conceptions of freedom contained in the various theories of free will. Among all philosophical problems, the problem of free will is perhaps the furthest from any comprehensive solution. Peter van Inwagen, born 1952, has written, "I conclude that there is no position that one can take on the matter of free will that does not confront its adherents with mystery. Although there are good arguments in defense of compatibilism or incompatibilism, each specific account of free will seems to run into serious difficulties." This situation raises an interesting question: why should we discuss free will if we cannot settle the question once and for all? I think there are several benefits that come from discussing free will even if the discussion remains inconclusive. First, by being aware that all positions about free will face serious challenges, we become more tolerant towards other positions that differ from our own assessment. Second, our discussion of free will has revealed that there are different respectable ways to think about freedom. Freedom is often said to be the central value of our country, but it is rare that people realize how many different ways there are to think about freedom. Because of this, I think it's useful to summarize the various conceptions of freedom that are contained within the various theories. One way to think about freedom is to think that people are free if they have the power to do what they want to do without any constraints. We might call this view freedom of action, which is supported by the traditional compatibilist account of freedom. An alternative way to think about freedom is to say that individuals are free if they are able to act on the desires they have determined to be their authentic desires. Let us call this perspective freedom as self-control. Finally, there is freedom as the power to be fully and ultimately responsible for all our actions, a view most closely associated with libertarianism. Our discussion shows that our own selves present one of the most mysterious and puzzling elements in the universe. Are we free agents with special causal powers? Or are we natural entities that are fully integrated within the causal network of the physical world? Both positions are plausible, but only one can be true. This is mysterious. Although we encounter ourselves every day, the nature of our own self stands in need of clarification. Thinking about the problem of free will has alerted us to the need to look at our own being more closely than we normally do in our day-to-day lives. If we avoid this reflection, we run the risk, as the poet Rainer Maria Rilke observed, of treating our lives like an envelope that we never open. Let us try to open this envelope and continue our exploration of the self in the next chapter. Study and reflection questions. 1. Imagine a situation in which you perform an action for which you are not fully responsible. Describe the situation, and then decide which theory of free will is best supported by this scenario. 2. Are we fully responsible for everything we do in our lives? Think about this question in light of the various theories of free will discussed in this chapter. How do these theories answer this question? What answer is most compatible with your own thinking about free will and moral responsibility? 3. If deep self-compatibilism is right, then we need to distinguish between authentic and inauthentic desires. Is there a clear method available through which we can identify whether a desire is authentic? If yes, please describe the method. If not, does this undermine the plausibility of deep self-compatibilism? 4. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre once wrote that we humans are condemned to be free. Could Sartre be right that freedom might be a burden and a punishment rather than a gift? What do you think? Has freedom ever been a burden in your life? 5. The contemporary British philosopher Ted Honderich has argued that our lives become better if we admit that we are not the ultimate originators of our successes and failures in life. He thinks that even if our character and actions are not within our control, we cannot know how things will turn out for us, and so we must go on trying to do the best we can. If Honderich is right, hard determinism gives us no reason for despair. Life can still be good even if we admit that we are not in control and have no free will. To what degree do you agree with Honderich's thinking about the effects of hard determinism?